when I was growing up, we attended the Unitarian Church. Part of the curriculum as I went into the 4th and 5th grade was a book called The Beginnings of Earth and Sky. That is all of the traditions of how we began. And then the beginnings of life and death. And they were stories taken from all over the world. When we moved to the Army base in Germany, there wasn't a Unitarian church. But my mother knew that I was going to need socialization, and so they encouraged me to join the children's choir. But they also encouraged reaching out and learning other traditions. And so on Saturday mornings, I would go to choir practice, and then I would join up with my Jewish friend Bert and his family, and I would go to synagogue. I didn't understand a word of what was being said, but I enjoyed it. And on Sunday morning, I would sing in the 9 o'clock service, attend the 10 o'clock mass, and then I would go join Bert and his family for Sunday dinner. I do remember, and oh yeah, and on Saturdays, I also went to Catholic catechism. only until I asked some question about the resurrection. I don't remember what the question was, but I do remember Father Mike really hurt my feelings because he brought his hand down on the desk and he said, "Margaret Allen, if you ever become a Catholic, I will turn you over my knee and paddle you." It was, and I'm sure that it was said like a parent whose child has just bent the last straw. When we came back from Germany, I continued to attend the Unitarian Church here in Columbus. And then as I went into my 20s and 30s, life presented some slams and I needed something else. I needed something else. And at the time, I was at war with God. My grandmother had died. Right after I had screamed at her that I hated her and wished she would die, she got caught in electrical fire at the apartment. And I never got a chance to take those words back. And I went to war with God and I started drinking. And I went through the Baptist church, the Methodist church, the Lutheran church, a Southern Baptist church, desperately looking for something and never could find it. And then when I was in my 40s, I have never understood why God took a Unitarian and a person who had spent her entire adult life being at war with him and plunked her down in the middle of the Catholic Church. But he did. And it was a healing parish. And I went through the year of questioning. That included 2 interviews with that Father Mike. And at one point I had said to him, he asked me why I was still so unsure. And I said, "Father Mike, I have not done obedience since I was 2 years old, and I don't think I'm going to start now." And he laughed. He said maybe the Pope wouldn't understand, but God would. It was the kindest thing he could have said. This man, there was something special about him, Amy. At one point during that year, as we approached baptism, there were 8 of us in this class, and he had us up in front of the altar, kneeling. And he went down behind us, and he was saying prayers for peace, prayers for healing. And he put his hands up above my head. You could feel it. He had healing in his hands. You could feel it. I actually had never experienced anything like that before. I was very at home with Catholicism, with the Mass. I do miss it. My younger daughter, Bonnie, she was 13 that year, and she wanted to do baptism too. And I had said to her, my sense is that you want to do this because I'm doing it. I want you to do the year of searching. You go to the classes and you go to the interviews and you make sure that this is a commitment that you want to make. And the following year, she also did baptism. My mother was very upset. She thought that me becoming a Catholic meant I was turning my back on everything that I had been raised with. When I finally explained it to my father, many years after my mother had died, he seemed to understand. Amy, I had such a need to be forgiven. I had made terrible decisions within my mortal self, and they had hurt people that I loved. And I had this terrible need to be forgiven. And at St. Joe's, they do a semi-submersion. So you step into this pool of water and kneel down. And then as Father Mike asks the baptismal questions, he's pouring water over your head. And all the bad went away. It was like everything got washed away, which was what I needed. And I have never regretted that decision. Bonnie did all of the ceremony the following year and was quite comfortable with her choice. And then in her late 20s, as many of us do, she lost her faith. She was beginning to find her way back at the end of her 20s and had started attending a small Catholic church near her. She had developed a seizure disorder after Arik was born. And at the end of January in 2001, she had a really bad seizure in the middle of the night and her body couldn't recover. When Elizabeth and I brought the children here, we made the decision that we would follow what we knew their mother wanted. And so I made visits to the two Catholic churches near me, about a mile on either side of where we were living. One of the Catholic churches had serious rich people in it. And I don't do rich people. I just don't. And I get very uncomfortable. I went down to the other one and I really liked that church. I liked the congregation. But when I sat down to talk with the priest, I didn't get a good feeling. I've never been able to explain it. I've just learned to listen to it. And my niece, Amanda, is working now on her PhD. She is, as it was at the time, an Anglican sort of missionary. She was doing teaching English as a second language in China, but also doing undercover missionary work. And I finally got in touch with her and I said, what am I supposed to do? And she had said, well, Aunt Margie, try the Anglican church. Well, if you Google Anglican, guess what you get? You get Episcopal. St. John's Episcopal Church in Worthington is a beautiful building, and I had walked past it many times on my way to high school. So I called, and Father Philip, his voice was so warm. And he actually knew what a Unitarian was. I didn't have to explain it. And I explained the journey and why I was calling. And he just said, well, why don't you try coming to a service? See if it fits. If it doesn't, you will find another place. And if it does, you will be home. And 2 weeks later, I walked into St. John's. This man I had never met before walked up and called me by name and hugged me and said, welcome. And people in the congregation did the same thing. And 4 or 5 people even told me who they were and what they did, and if I needed any help to reach out. And I was just home. And all of a sudden, when the service started, Amy, I knew when to stand, when to kneel, when to sing. I knew all the response. I was home. I still do my questioning. There are parts of the creed that I sort of don't say. Because one of the wonderful women in this church, when I mentioned it to her, she said, if you don't believe it, don't say it. And her partner does that. I just have always been home. What I find is that the people, some of the younger people, but some of the people my age who have had a life very much like mine that exposes them to other cultures or other people, they're more accepting of my eclectic faith. I know that as a traditional Christian, I'm supposed to say God the Father, God the Son, God the Holy Ghost, but many times for me, the mental vision of God in a religious church context is this sort of tyrannical God who will punish. And I can't deal with that, because for me, God is love. He doesn't punish. He gave us free will. He does expect us to live with the consequences of the choices, but he doesn't punish. When I started my learning journey in Arizona with the Apache and the Tohono O'odham and the Pima people, I was introduced to the term grandfather. And for me, that's what God is. The grandfather who pulls you into his lap and says, it's going to be okay. So sometimes I use grandfather, and sometimes I use God, and sometimes I use Great Spirit. Sometimes I don't say anything at all. I'm still trying to get comfortable with the prayer book, because I wasn't raised on written prayer. Many times in my life, my prayer has been a matter of going out and facing this guy and throwing my hands up and just letting my thoughts go. When I first started doing meditation years ago, it was during a Healing the Inner Child workshop. And I remember being amazed at how noisy my brain was and how hard it was to make myself focus. With the years of training, plus the ceremony of the sweat, plus the prayer during sun dances, I have learned to almost immediately start relaxing when I go into meditation mode or prayer mode. It's a very comfortable place for me. And sometimes, like this morning, when I lit the sage and used the feather to bring the smoke around me, the prayer just sort of comes, lift the anger, help me use the grief to understand Nicholas, help me use the grief to help him through this anniversary. I have lived a good life. Help me find a way to use the lessons. And sometimes my prayer is sitting here in the dining room with an empty brain. It isn't an intentional thing. But I always get the answer. It isn't always the answer that I want. It isn't always the answer that I expect. And when that happens, my late sponsor's voice comes through my head. As she told me once, Margaret, you won't always get what you want, but you will always be provided what you need. Those very wise words came from a woman who considered herself an atheist. And I've never known anybody who had a more spiritual grounding than she did. And I suppose that that's true. Sometimes I'm reluctant to explore deeper meditation. I'm sort of an empath. I have never been able to find someone I feel safe enough with to just completely explore what being an empath is. I know that I used it as a nurse. I know I was wise enough to know I had no business being a counselor because I couldn't draw that boundary that people need. I think part of what I'm experiencing today is because I picked up on Nicholas's, and I can't quite separate from it. And yet, as we meet each week, there's a part of me that would like to find a place where I could explore it. I'm afraid to do it on my own because I'm afraid I will get lost. When I do meditation here at home, I set the alarm on my phone. And when we do our prayers on Tuesday, I'm so grateful for your bell. I'm not afraid to do it because I know your bell will bring me back. And I don't know if it's a bad thing to be afraid. The mood that I'm in right now, please understand, I have a counselor I see every week. When I get like this, the first words out of my mouth at each meeting are, I am not going to walk out in front of a bus. But the feelings of uncertainty and grief are strong enough that if I don't have something to bring me back, it would be easy to just stop the journey. Just quit. I'm tired, Amy. And yet, I have a sense that I am needed. And I have a sense that whatever is coming is going to be very challenging. And I will need to be able to find those quiet moments where I can just go down and into my brain. I have this mental image of myself. There was a poster when my ex-husband and I ran the commercial art department at Long's bookstore. There was a poster we had on the wall. I do not want to talk to you. It was a rope with a knot. There was a kitten with its claws embedded in the knot. And it said, when you reach the end of your rope, hang on. That's the image I carry with myself some days, is that I have my hand up here to God and I'm just hanging on. Don't drop me now. And that will usually get me through whatever that period is. And that's almost totally opposite of the days when my late daughter was growing up and we were coming out from really bad domestic violence. And she was so challenged. And I was so tired. And I went out in the middle of my backyard at 10 o'clock one night, scared the hell out of my neighbor. I went out in the backyard at 10 o'clock one night and looked up at this wonderful Michigan sky and pointed at my shoulders and said, how the hell big do you think these things are? Anyway, get off my shoulders. And I waited for the bolt of lightning to come and hit me. And of course, it never did. In the sermon on Sunday, Gia had started with a quote from a book called Evensong. It's a memoir. And the quote from the author is, some of life's best prayers come from anger. And I didn't understand at first. But apparently, she and her husband were going through just one of life's bad spots. And her husband had a heart attack. And she was riding in the front seat of the ambulance as they are trying to revive him and get him to the hospital. And she said, her words were, "God damn it, you get down here and do something and you bring him back." And her husband survived. But that's what she had meant. Sometimes best prayers come from anger. So when I was explaining about this country road that I ended up on Sunday after the visit with Nicholas, the rational return road would have been a left-hand turn and go back through Chillicothe and Circleville and all the traffic on 23. The capricious turn to the right after you got through with the 10 miles of West Virginia type roads was this incredibly peaceful countryside. And it was like, I was probably an hour into the drive when I was able to say thank you for Ohio's version of the desert. There were no people, there was no machinery. I was humming 2 hymns that I haven't hummed for years that came from the back of my head somewhere. But it was almost like coming out of there, I had, without knowing, said, "Help me." And this was God's way of helping me. Turn right. I have no idea what's ahead. I think I'm really grateful that I don't know what's ahead. I'm at a point in my life journey that many of us reach where I do a lot of, reminiscing, retrospection. I write down the stories. But I'm also at that point where I'm very well aware that the journey is coming to an end. And I'm trying, as I do this sort of pitch and organize, I'm trying to make the life that I have now as least hectic as it can be for my children when they have to sort it. But it's also a part of the journey that there aren't a lot of people to talk about it with. When you work in nursing, you become very familiar with dying. When you work in hospice, you learn how to help families say goodbye while celebrating the person that's leaving. And you sort of get comfortable with the idea that you're going to die. But for many people who don't have that learned experience, talking about impending death or considering impending death is very threatening. And they're very uncomfortable with it. So right now I do a lot of talking to God. My late aunt remained in the Baptist church that she and my father grew up in. Very firm faith, but you would have liked her. When my uncle retired from Boeing, they moved to Wisconsin and they bought this wonderfully large farmhouse and they created a bed and breakfast that they operated for about 15 years. And when it came time for them to move on from that, they bought an RV and they spent their summers traveling the East Coast of the United States, working with the ranches and the halfway houses that deal with juveniles who have been in trouble. And their way, my Aunt Florence would have understood becoming beloved community. She would have grabbed hold and run with it. They built fences. She taught girls how to sew. He taught girls how to handle a hammer. She taught the boys how to do laundry. That was the way that they practiced their faith. But she really didn't understand my becoming a Catholic. And toward the end of her life, she had a tumor that was growing, and I had gone down to the retirement center where she and my dad lived. And at the request of my cousins, I had gone down to spend the last couple of weeks near her. And we were sitting out on the back porch one day, and she finally said, "Margaret, do you pray to Mary?" Well, not exactly. I said, "Aunt Florence, I don't get down on my knees and say, Mother Mary, please give me. But I have long conversations with Mary." And she said, "Why?" I said, "Because Mary knows what it's like to lose a child. And many of my friends don't know that. So when things get tough, I talk to Mary because she knows what that feels like." Sometimes when I get frustrated, I will talk to Jesus because I know he got frustrated. Like Jesus said, he was holy, but for 33 years, he was also completely human with all the frailties. And I know he got frustrated. And the day he walked into the temple and tore it apart, I have no doubt that those people were afraid of him. He had spent 3 years in the desert. He had spent his childhood growing up in a carpenter's shop. My guess is when he raised his arms, you could see the muscles. And I have no doubt that his rage was real. So when I get very angry, sometimes I talk to Jesus. And sometimes when I'm not sure, sometimes I talk to Peter. When I first went to Santa Vera, the mission south of Tucson, and I walked in there, I had been to 2 sweat ceremonies at that point. And I had attended one powwow and been part of a talking circle. And I walked in, and the people there on the Santa Vera Reservation have grown up within that faith. And there are saints there where you can in a prayer. There are sacred garments there that you can touch. And I remember telling my mother, now I understand why the Catholic Church made inroads faster than the Protestant Church did, because they have saints. And the indigenous people have their spirits that they talk to. They understood talking to saints. I haven't quite got the hang yet of talking to saints. I may never, because it wasn't part of my childhood. And sometimes when I'm really struggling and I put my hands out and I say, help me, it isn't so much God help me, it's help me. Whatever spirit is walking around there at that moment. And maybe part of understanding where I get to faith-wise is best understood by anyone who has ever read Mark Twain's Letters from the Earth and laughed their way through it. It's a the Archangel Michael has come down to Earth to see how the grand experiment is going. And he is writing letters back to St. Peter. And his reports of the grand experiment are just wonderful. And it's a very tongue-in-cheek look at society as it was like in the 1920s. And one of my favorite ones was when he said, these people down here, they can't play a musical instrument. God will roll over in his grave before they can ever hold a tune properly. But they all seem to think that they're going to come up there and sing and play harps. Can you understand the ungodly noise we're going to have to live with? I mean, sometimes that's where my faith is. Sometimes it's because none of us know what comes afterwards. There is an episode in Star Trek where everybody that we have grown up loving with Star Trek dies in an explosion of the ship. And Mr. Spock and Dr. McCoy and Captain Kirk and Scotty all end up in completely different scenarios. And Captain Kirk ends up in some mountain cabin with children and a wife that he talks to. And McCoy is down south and he's drinking a mint julep or whatever it is they call it. I mean, it's like each one of us has or has been taught to have a picture of what the afterlife will be. But I know that the night my mother died, I walked out onto the balcony of my apartment and looked up at the Arizona sky and said, I'm so glad you don't hurt anymore. And burst into tears and said, I'm not ready to be the storyteller. My mother was the storyteller. But I had this vision or this sense, not because I didn't really see anything. It was this sense of her spirit simply joining everybody who'd gone before in the Milky Way. And shortly after that, there was a young man who came to the Wednesday night sweat. He was Navajo. He had grown up deep in the Navajo area. His grandfather was a medicine man, a singer, and he had been training to become a singer. And somehow he had managed to earn a scholarship to the University of Arizona. And he had come to school. He was off the reservation for the very first time in his life, 19 years old. And the second year that he was at school, his grandfather passed away. And there was no way for him to get home for the rituals. And it was my friend and teacher, Ray, who let me know. And he said, I just thought maybe you could help. The Wednesday night sweat was always divided into the women's sweat lodge and the men's sweat lodge. So it wasn't like we were sharing anything in the lodges. But afterwards, we were standing in between the lodges. And Amy, I have never seen the Milky Way the way it was that night. It literally spread from horizon to horizon. It was so bright. And I introduced myself to him and I mentioned that Ray had let me know his grandfather had started the next journey. And he said, yes. I pointed up to the Milky Way and I said, I think my mother and your grandfather are looking down at us and laughing because we're still stuck here. And that apparently was exactly the right thing to say. I've never known where the words came from. Because then he started talking. Well, it's that kind of shared experience that now makes up my faith. And even when I'm sitting in church, there will be moments, it will be a piece of music that's being played. It will be a particular psalm. And sometimes it's in the preparation of communion. It will just be this moment when the two worlds mesh. Sometimes that's how I feel on our circle nights. It's like my two worlds mesh. And I'm home again. I hope that makes sense. I'm home again. And I don't know if anybody will ever be interested in this. but I'm grateful that you gave me a chance to share it. It's been a while since I've just sort of wandered through. At Yavapai, the tradition was Wednesday nights we had a women's sweat lodge and a men's sweat lodge. And then on Saturday nights, there was a different pourer of the water, and we had a mixed sweat lodge. The way that I was taught, sweat lodges were created by the women. And so the men would have an idea of what it took to have a baby. The sweat lodges were very hot. You had to crawl in, you had to crawl out. And in the beginning, the women stood outside the sweat lodge and they sang the prayers. In the women's sweat lodge, my water pourer was a Yavapai woman who was a nurse with the Indian Health Service. And I got really tired initially when we would do the prayers. And the prayers were done in 4 rounds. There's the infant round where you are completely egocentric. You are praying for whatever is going wrong. And then there is a child round where you're sort of praying for things that go bump in the night. There is an adult round where you are praying for the community. And when we would get to that round of prayer, it was always cheerful. You could, even though you couldn't see, you could hear from her tone of voice. It was always cheerful, and she was always asking that the community be relieved of the white man's disease. She was talking about alcoholism. And I got defensive when she first started doing it. And it wasn't until I asked my friend Ray about it that he said, yes, we Indians had fermented drinks. There's a wonderful drink that's made with the saguaro syrup. And it was fermented. It was used for ceremonies. But that was completely different than the whiskey that got introduced. So for the white immigrants to introduce whiskey was not a lot different than if you gave whiskey to a 3-year-old. And it made a white man's disease. But you know, Amy, having been through the last 3 years, I understand that early introduction into owning my part, because I am part of the immigrants. So my part as far as being white, owning that people who came before me introduced this, even if my family was not directly part of it. The fact that I live in Columbus, Ohio, means that somewhere the predecessors were part of this. That was sort of preparation for the training that became part of becoming beloved community when we started doing sacred ground. It helped me not be so defensive. And now we are dealing with the Indian children that disappeared. And I spent a couple of days virtually up on the Sioux Reservation as the children were welcomed home and then reburied, and could feel the ache and could cry and could honestly say, I am so sorry. It helps me now to listen, like to my grandson, who is mixed. When he gets angry and reminds us that his mother and I didn't raise him to be Black, he's right. We raised him to be Michael. We didn't prepare him for the adult world that he would go into. At 25, he's begun to forgive us and understand that what we gave him instead was the strength of being Michael. I think that becoming beloved community is so important. And it's a concept that makes so much sense to me because my family, I used to call us the Rainbow Family because we're a mixture of cultures. And the only requirement for friends coming into the house was that they speak decent English. In other words, they couldn't swear and they couldn't use street jargon. And they had to respect my mother. Those were the only requirements that my dad had. And I don't understand prejudice. I don't understand wanting to live separately. It makes no sense to me. Because that's not who God made us to be. Among the Native beliefs is that each group of people had a purpose. The white man's purpose was to take care of the ocean, of the polar cap. The people that they referred to as the yellow people, their purpose had to do with plants and medicines and healing. People from Africa, the Black people, their purpose was to care for the animals. And the red man's purpose was to care for the earth. That's the way that they saw it. And it was all part of what they call Turtle Island, which is the earth. And that makes so much sense to me. I have never been able to believe in a God or a Jesus that would keep somebody out of the ever after because they don't say a certain prayer a certain way. I do believe that God made me or created me somehow. I also believe that he gave me a brain and he knows that I use it. And he expects me to learn from the lessons. I also believe that he forgives. And in order for me to receive a lot of that forgiveness, it becomes part of my job to be part of the reconciliation or healing. That's what's expected. And I see that as part of this end period of my life. The first 3/4 of a century, I have spent doing a lot of learning, gaining a lot of understanding. And I see this next 1/4 century as using that to help heal some of the wounds that have occurred generations before me. And some of them have occurred within my generation. There were Indian babies being stolen out of cars and whisked away in the 1950s. That's still abhorrent to me. I still don't understand that. Because God didn't bring us this faith so that we could beat other people to death with it. He brought this faith so that we could help people grow. And I like the words that one of my favorite Native teachers told me once. And he said, God is big enough. He doesn't care what name you call him. He cares that you follow the path he's laid out. That's why sometimes I use grandfather and sometimes I use Great Spirit and sometimes I don't use a word at all. I think I'm done. I think I ran out of words. Oh, you're muted.
Thank you, Margaret.
Oh, wait, you're welcome. I just sort of got to the point I was running on and on. I thought,